thank you can be the hardest sentence to say when your body is failing, and the room is shrinking to the size of a hospital bed. Ozzy Osbourne spent a lifetime turning noise into a kind of shield, a way to keep the world at arm's length, while he marched through it like a myth. Yet the story of his final stretch, as many fans now keep replaying in their minds, is not about volume at all. It is about what happens when the lights go out, the crowd is gone, and the only people left are the ones who have to live with the silence after the legend. By the time he publicly confirmed his Parkinson's diagnosis in early 2020, he had already been living through a long run of health problems that made every step and every appearance feel earned rather than inevitable. What followed over the next years was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual narrowing. Touring ended. Surgeries and rehabilitation became the new schedule. Interviews, once full of swagger and mischief, began to carry a different weight, as if he was learning to measure time in smaller units. The public could see the battle, but the private reality was harsher. Chronic pain, reduced mobility, and the steady humiliation of needing help for things that used to be automatic. When a life is built on momentum, stillness can feel like punishment. For Ozzy, stillness became the final teacher. That is why his last major public moment landed the way it did. On July 5th, 2025, Villa Park in Birmingham hosted Back to the Beginning, a hometown farewell that reunited Black Sabbath's original lineup for a final bow and positioned Ozzy at the center of a night designed to feel like both celebration and closure. Reports describe a stadium packed with tens of thousands, with millions more watching, and a man who could no longer perform in the way people remembered, but who still showed up anyway. That contrast is what made it brutal. The Prince of Darkness, the figure who once seemed larger than consequences, now had to be physically accommodated by the stage itself. The image that circulated afterward was not the old Ozzy sprinting into a chorus, but Ozzy seated, anchored, present, absorbing the roar, as if he were taking one final measurement of what his life had meant to strangers. A farewell concert is always a negotiation between fantasy and truth. Fans want the myth to stand up straight. Reality insists on the chair, the careful movements, the pauses. Yet there was a kind of dignity in the refusal to hide. The night did not pretend he was fine. It simply let him be there, in the city where it started, surrounded by the sound he helped invent. That choice mattered because it reframed the ending. It was no longer about the collapse. It was about the courage to appear at all, to let the public witness the human cost of survival. In the days after Villa Park, the emotional tone shifted from celebration to vigilance. When someone has spent years outlasting predictions, people start believing he will outlast this too. But the truth about long illnesses is that they can change speed without warning. The body can hold the line for months and then surrender in a week. On July 22nd, 2025, news outlets reported that Ozzy Osbourne had died at the age of 76. The public statement shared by his family emphasized peace and privacy, the kind of restrained wording that often follows a long goodbye. And then came the part that always happens after a cultural giant dies, the scramble to capture a final sentence, a final message, a final crystal of meaning that can make grief feel organized. The YouTube narration you shared leans into that impulse, presenting final words as a whispered, cinematic punctuation mark. It is important to treat that kind of detail carefully. Unless the family or attending medical professionals publicly confirm a specific quote, it remains part of a story people tell themselves to cope with the feeling of unfinished business. What is verifiable, and perhaps more powerful than any perfectly scripted line, is the shape of the ending itself. A final hometown appearance that looked directly at reality, followed shortly by a death that closed a chapter quietly. That quiet is the part fans struggle to accept. Ozzy's career trained people to expect spectacle, even in catastrophe. But the older you get, the more endings stop performing for the audience. They become intimate. They become administrative. They become a hand held between two breaths. And in that intimacy, the meaning of his legacy shifts. It is no longer only the outrageous moments and the mayhem. It is also endurance, the stubborn act of staying here long enough to say goodbye in the place that made you. The night in Birmingham did not feel like a normal concert. It felt like an agreement, an unspoken pact between a legend and the people who had carried him for decades. In the story you shared, the organizers avoided words like final and goodbye, but the atmosphere didn't need subtitles. Everyone in that stadium understood what was happening. This was a farewell disguised as a celebration, a last public breath taken on home soil. Villa Park was close enough to the factories and fog of Assen to make the symbolism sting. You could almost hear the echo of a young man's first hunger for escape in the way the crowd went quiet when Ozzy appeared. He didn't walk out like he used to. He was helped. He was placed. And instead of pretending that nothing had changed, the scene leaned into the truth. He sat on a specially built throne at center stage, elevated, not to glorify him, but to make him visible in the state he was in. The body that once bounced off chaos now needed structure around it. That single image did more than 1,000 headlines ever could. What made it painful wasn't just frailty. It was a collision of eras. Above him, massive screens played a collage. Childhood snapshots, wild tour footage, moments of family tenderness. The past roared while the present stayed quiet. It was like watching two versions of the same man occupy the same room, one unstoppable, one exhausted, both equally real. When the microphone reached him, he did not deliver a speech. He did not build a monologue. He said just enough to prove he was still there. I don't know what to say. The story hasn't begun, and in that sentence you can feel the weight of every stage he ever commanded. Ozzy was never famous for being polished. Yet here, in the most important moment, his honesty hit harder than performance. "You've been with me all this time," he says. "Thank you from the bottom of my heart." No theatrics, no mask, just a man acknowledging that he did not survive alone. And then the night did something quietly cruel. It continued without him. One by one, guests took the stage, old allies and newer disciples, turning his life into a living tribute while he watched from the throne like a king attending his own memorial. The story highlights familiar names, familiar songs, familiar gestures of respect. But the key detail is not who played. It's what Ozzy did not do. He didn't sing. That part of his life, the narrative insists, was behind him. Instead, he listened. He absorbed the sound of other voices, carrying what used to be his role. That is a different kind of courage than the world celebrates. People applaud the comeback, the defiance, the last-minute miracle. But there is bravery in sitting still while others perform the thing you once owned. There is bravery in letting your legacy pass through other throats, other hands, other bodies, while you remain present enough to feel it. Backstage, the story paints a room full of people trying not to break. Crew members who had followed him for decades, wiping tears. Friends struggling to speak without choking on the word they all avoided. On the surface, it was a party. Underneath, it was closure. A loud goodbye dressed in the clothing of a hometown victory lap. Then comes a detail that, in this style of storytelling, matters almost as much as the music. The idea that the event raised an enormous amount for charity, particularly Parkinson's research and children's causes. Whether or not the numbers are exact, the emotional function is clear. It reframes the night as more than nostalgia. It turns it into a final gift, a last act of meaning that says, even if the body is failing, something can still be offered. And just when the crowd thought they had time, the narrative cuts the cord. After about an hour, Ozzy is wheeled off stage quietly. Not a dramatic exit, not a curtain call, a retreat. Some might have called it leaving early, but the story insists it was a perfect ending. A man stepping away from thunder and returning to the quiet he had already been living in. That's the moment where the mood shifts. Because once he is gone from the stage, the myth stops being protected by lights and sound. The world begins to process what it has seen. Social media explodes. Tributes roll in. People share grainy photos, old interviews, jokes, disasters, triumphs. Every chaotic fragment that made him feel immortal. But the underlying message is the same. They can't believe it is ending, and they can't deny that it is. And then, in the story, we follow him home. The estate in Buckinghamshire is described as sprawling, beautiful, and strangely smaller than it used to be. Illness does that. It takes a big house and reduces it to a few rooms that matter. The care space, the bed, the chair by the window. Over time, rooms convert into stations, oxygen equipment, medication fridges. therapy setups, until the home becomes a sanctuary of routine. The kind of routine that looks gentle until you realize it is built to hold back collapse. Sharon is there, always there, as a steady architecture around a man whose body no longer cooperates. To the outside world, she remains composed and strategic. Inside the walls, she becomes something different, an anchor that cannot afford to drift. Their children arrive. Schedules are cleared. People move softly through hallways. Even the grandchildren are described as tiptoeing, sensing the gravity without understanding its name. The family, the narrative says, doesn't hold a dramatic meeting or speak the words out loud. They don't need to. They simply know. And what replaces conversation is a kind of shared silence that is heavier than any speech. Daily life narrows to comfort. Tea and toast. Old horror films. Classic rock documentaries. Ozzy drifts in and out, sometimes cracking a joke, sometimes staring at nothing, sometimes reaching for a hand as if touch is the last reliable language. The story emphasizes his mood, not rage, not panic, but stillness. A stillness that feels almost unnatural for someone who once lived like a storm. And that is where the story plants its next hook, because it keeps repeating one unsettling idea. He is waiting for something, not resisting, not retreating, waiting, like a performer who knows the encore is over and the curtain is about to fall. But what is he waiting for? A person? A moment? A final sentence? The house in Buckinghamshire was large enough to swallow sound, but in those final weeks it wasn't the size that mattered. It was the way illness makes even a mansion feel like a single hallway, a single room, a single chair. In the story you shared, Ozzy's world kept narrowing until everything that used to define him, tour buses, dressing rooms, hotel suites, roaring stadiums, was replaced by a quiet routine measured in medication, rest, and the gentle discipline of people trying to make a difficult thing as painless as possible. After, back to the beginning. The energy outside the estate became louder, but inside it grew softer. That contrast is one of the cruelest parts of late life decline. The public is finally celebrating you the way you always deserved, while your private life is being dismantled piece by piece. The narrative describes the estate as having been gradually transformed, rooms repurposed into care spaces, a nurse's station tucked into the home, oxygen equipment humming, medication stored like a daily ritual rather than an emergency measure. It's not a dramatic scene. It's mundane. And that mundanity is what makes it devastating, because it signals how long the family has been preparing for this without saying so out loud. In this telling, Sharon becomes the emotional architecture of the household. The world sees her as composed and pragmatic, the steady public face who manages updates and boundaries. But inside the walls, she's described as the anchor holding everything together, keeping the rhythm of the home steady while the person at the center of it becomes more fragile by the day. This is not the glamorous side of devotion. It's the part where love becomes logistical. Who stays overnight? Who takes the morning shift? Who sits closest when he wakes? Who remembers the sugar in the tea the way he likes it? Because small familiar choices are sometimes the only dignity left. The children return in the way adult children always do when something is closing. Jack flies in. Kelly clears her schedule. They don't announce it like a family meeting. They just arrive and stay. Even the grandchildren are present, moving quietly through the hallways, sensing the gravity without being able to name it. The narrative emphasizes there were no dramatic speeches, no staged final conversations for the benefit of memory. Instead, everyone simply knew, and the silence between them carried more meaning than anything they could have said. The daily rhythm settles into a delicate pattern. Ozzy wakes mid-morning after vitals are checked and medication is given. Breakfast is small, tea and toast, sometimes barely that. On better days, he asks for old horror films or classic rock documentaries. Not necessarily because he's watching closely, but because the familiarity feels like a hand on the shoulder. He drifts off halfway through, wakes again, dozes again. Nobody complains. The point is comfort, not performance. What strikes the people around him, the story says, is his mood. He isn't angry. He isn't frantic. He is still. Stillness can be misread as resignation, but here it's portrayed as presence, an unusual calm that makes a room feel both sacred and haunted. Ozzy, who built a brand on chaos, now seems almost contemplative, as if he's done fighting the way the world expects men like him to fight. The narrative frames this as a kind of acceptance that does not look like surrender. It looks like a man choosing to spend his remaining energy on connection instead of resistance. And connection in the story becomes physical because speech is no longer reliable. He holds eye contact a beat longer than usual. He reaches out and suddenly grasps a hand. He communicates and squeezes, small nods, murmurs that don't always land as words. These gestures are described as deliberate, like he's counting the seconds left but not panicking about them. That image is chilling because it's so human. It strips away the costume and leaves only the person. Visitors are restricted. Sharon limits who can come, and even the trusted ones are allowed only brief moments. A longtime bandmate is described as expecting tension or chaos and finding instead a quiet peace. Ozzy thin, pale, but deeply present. The staff maintains consistency. The same meals, the same medication schedule, the same gentle reminders. But underneath the routine is an unspoken truth. It is getting harder. Breathing becomes more labored. Sleep becomes longer. Communication becomes inconsistent. There are fewer good days, and even the good days come with an edge, because everyone knows what a good day now costs them. Then the narrative gives you one of its most haunting vignettes. Ozzy sitting by the window, staring out for nearly an hour. No music, no television, no conversation. Just the garden swaying in the breeze. The kind of ordinary movement that becomes mesmerizing when your own body refuses to cooperate. The story suggests he might be thinking about his childhood in Aston, or stadiums chanting his name, or perhaps nothing at all. And when Sharon asks what he's thinking, he reportedly answers with a line that lands like a poem. Nothing. Everything. That sentence works because it captures the emotional contradiction of end-of-life awareness. In one sense, there is nothing left to plan, no tours, no deadlines, no next move. In another sense, everything is present at once. Regrets, love, memory, gratitude, fear, relief, the strange tenderness of being cared for. Nothing. Everything. It's the kind of line people repeat afterward because it gives shape to feelings that have no shape. And this is where the story begins to tighten the pressure. It repeats again that he seems to be waiting for something. That detail matters because it creates an uneasy anticipation, like a performer who knows the show is ending but hasn't heard the final cue. The family senses it too. They don't name it, but they feel it in the heaviness of each visit, each whisper exchange, each hand held a little longer than usual. The physical decline continues, but the narrative insists there are moments of clarity, moments where the mind is sharp even as the body fails. That contrast is another knife twist. People can accept frailty if they can believe the person is not really there. What breaks him is realizing he is still there, still feeling, still understanding, still present enough to recognize that time is almost gone. When the story turns toward the hospital, it does it quickly, almost abruptly, because that's how these transitions often happen in real life. The second week of July, a high fever arrives overnight, then shortness of breath, then fatigue that feels different from usual. Given his history, the family acts immediately. Sharon makes the call without hesitation. A private transfer is arranged by mid-morning. In the narrative, this decision carries the weight of a final threshold. Once you cross into a hospital room, time starts behaving differently. It becomes measured. It becomes monitored. It becomes clinical. At the hospital, he is stabilized. But staff sense this is not an ordinary setback. The room is described as sterile white walls, the hum of equipment, the soft beeping of monitors. Ozzy has always hated hospitals, calling them gray little prisons. Yet this time he does not resist. He allows the IVs, the scans, the oxygen mask. He isn't fighting. He is accepting. And acceptance in this story feels more unsettling than panic, because it suggests the body knows what the mind has already begun to understand. Sharon stays at his side, refusing to leave for more than minutes. Jack and Kelly take turns sitting with him. The doctors explain that every measure will be taken, but the body is too worn down to bounce back the way it once did. Ozzy spends most of the second day with his eyes closed, opening them now and then to scan the room as if he's looking for something or someone. When Sharon asks if he's in pain, he shakes his head. "No," he whispers. "I'm just thinking." That line, quiet, minimal, almost mundane, sets the stage for what the narrative is clearly saving for last. Because the story has been building toward a final moment that isn't loud. It isn't theatrical. It isn't designed for an audience. It is intimate, almost unbearably so. The monitors still beep. The breathing grows slower. The family gathers again near midnight. A doctor checks his pulse and gives Sharon a small nod. And in that nod, the story implies everything becomes immediate. The hospital room was the opposite of everything Ozzy Osbourne had ever been. No smoke, no distortion, no stage heat, only sterile walls and the soft tyranny of machines that count time in beeps. In the account you shared, his transfer to a private London hospital happened fast, the way real emergencies do. A fever that spiked overnight, breath that grew shallow, fatigue that didn't feel like one more bad day, but like a door quietly closing. At first it was framed as precautionary observation, the kind of language families use when they still need hope to stand upright. But the people around him felt the shift immediately. Some of the staff had cared for him before, and they sensed that this admission carried a different weight. Not panic, not drama, a stillness that wasn't emptiness, more like inevitability. Ozzy had never liked hospitals. He joked about them, cursed them, called them gray prisons. Yet this time he didn't resist. That detail matters because it changes the tone of everything that follows. When a person stops fighting the logistics, lets the nurses tape the floor, accept the oxygen mask, turns his face toward the scanner without complaint, it doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means he's saving his remaining strength for the only thing that still matters, the people at his bedside. Sharon stayed close enough to be counted as part of his breathing. In the narrative, she refuses to leave for more than a few minutes at a time, holding his hand the way you hold a fragile object you cannot replace. Jack and Kelly arrive quickly and take turns sitting beside him, not asking the questions families ask when they still believe in bargaining. The doctors explain what the body has already announced. Every measure will be taken, but there are limits even medicine cannot negotiate with. After years of surgeries, pain, Parkinson's, and a slow grind of decline, there isn't much margin left. Most of the second day passes with Ozzy's eyes closed. He opens them only in short bursts, long enough to scan the room as if he's searching for something that isn't there anymore, or perhaps confirming what is. When Sharon asks if he's in pain, he shakes his head. In the account, he whispers, "No, I'm just thinking." And that sentence lands with a strange force because it is so ordinary. It isn't poetic. It isn't mystical. It's the kind of thing you'd say on any night you can't sleep, except now the stakes of the entire life behind it. As night folds over the hospital, the atmosphere tightens. Machines continue their steady rhythm, indifferent as metronomes. Breathing grows slower, heavier, more laborious. A doctor checks him, then gives Sharon a small nod, one of those tiny gestures that carries a whole sentence no one wants to say aloud. The family draws closer, not in a dramatic circle, not in a staged tableau, but in the quiet way people move when they realize the moment is finally here. This is where the story you share becomes almost unbearably intimate. It doesn't describe a grand farewell or a theatrical speech. It describes a whisper. Ozzy opens his eyes, looks at the people he loves, and speaks with the last clean thread of voice he has left. The video's narration attributes his final words to a simple message of gratitude and devotion, something along the lines of, he loved doing it until the end, and he thanks him from the bottom of his heart. It is important to understand what makes that kind of line so devastating, even if the exact wording is only circulating through second-hand accounts. It is not the content alone. It is the reversal of expectation. The world trained itself to think of Ozzy as chaos with a grin, wildness, spectacle, rebellion. Yet the closing image is not a man roaring at death. It is a man whispering thanks. And then there is the silence that follows. In the account, nobody speaks right away. Nobody performs grief. They just sit with the words, as if they await you can feel settling on your skin. A nurse later describes a moment as something she had never seen before, because what happens in that room isn't celebrity. It isn't myth. It's the purest human exchange. A person trying to leave behind a final shape of love while he still can. After that, there are no more sentences, only gestures, a squeeze of Sharon's hand, a slow blink, a stare at the ceiling that looks less like fear and more like release. This is the part that breaks people, the realization that the end is rarely cinematic in the way movies teach us. It doesn't always arrive with a speech or a perfect closing line. It arrives with final breath and the sound of someone else quietly trying not to fall apart. And yet, in a strange way, the quiet ending fits the arc of his life, because in the months before, he had already made his public goodbye. He had already returned back to beginning and let the world see him as he truly was. Older, limited, but present. The stadium got the thunder. The hospital got the truth. When the news broke on July 22nd, 2025, major outlets reported his death at age 76, and the world responded the way it always does when a cultural pillar falls. Tributes, shock, a sudden flood of memories from people who never met him but felt they knew him. But inside that hospital room, none of that mattered. Not the headlines, not the legacy, not the endless replays of who he used to be. Only the final exchange did. Because the hardest thing about losing someone like Ozzy Osbourne is not that the world becomes quieter. It's that, for the people who loved him, the room becomes quiet first, and they have to live in that quiet long before the rest of us hear it. When the news finally escapes the walls of a private room, it doesn't arrive gently. It lands like a weight. In the story you shared, the announcement breaks on the morning of July 22nd, 2025, short, restrained, almost too small for the size of the man it describes. A few lines that try to do the impossible. Compress a lifetime into a sentence. Translate an entire era into a request for privacy. That contrast is always jarring. Ozzy Osbourne was never a quiet figure. Even people who weren't fans knew the outline of him. The voice, the controversies, the mythos, the chaos that somehow kept turning into survival. So when the narrative says he passed peacefully, surrounded by family, love, and light, it feels like hearing a storm described as a breeze. Not because it's untrue, but because our brains are trained to expect spectacle from legends. And here, the ending refuses to perform. The first wave is public grief, immediate, massive, almost automatic. The story describes social media flooding with tributes within minutes, a phrase trending globally. Fans posting old clips and grainy photos like they're trying to prove he existed in the first place. It's a modern phenomenon. When someone famous dies, people don't just mourn the person. They mourn the version of themselves that live alongside that person's music. Ozzy's voice wasn't only in headphones. It was in late-night drives, teenage anger, gym playlists, family arguments, first heartbreaks, reckless decisions, and quiet recoveries. When that voice stops, it feels like a personal loss even for strangers. But under the global noise, the story keeps pulling us back to the smallest circle, Sharon, Jack, Kelly. The people who are not grieving an icon, but a husband, a father, a man who took up space in their everyday lives long after the cameras stopped caring. In this telling, Sharon becomes almost silent in the days that follow. Composed in public, shattered in private. It's a familiar dynamic for families who have spent years managing a slow decline. When the end finally comes, there isn't always a dramatic breakdown. Sometimes there's simply exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that arrives after you've held yourself together for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be held. Jack's tribute, as described, is tender and direct. A childhood photo, a caption that frames Ozzy not as a star but as a hero and a dad. Kelly's message is even shorter and arguably more haunting. The world is quieter now. I miss your voice already. The narrative leans on those lines because they do what the big tributes cannot. They rescale the loss. They remind us the loudest man in the room was, to someone, simply the familiar voice down the hallway. Then come the industry statements, the ones that read like history writing itself in real time. Former bandmates described as calling him a brother, a voice of a generation, a piece of themselves. Fellow artists from different genres praising the contradiction that defined him. Chaos and compassion in the same body. These tributes aren't just politeness. They are acknowledgments of influence, of a sound that changed what rock could be, of a persona that opened doors for everyone who came after. In grief, people speak in superlatives because ordinary language feels insulting. But the story's point is subtler. Even the most famous people still reach for the same simple words when death shows up: love, brother, thank you, never again. And while celebrities post carefully chosen sentences, fans mourn with objects. That's one of the most human parts of the aftermath. Candles, flowers, vinyl records, handwritten letters left in places that carry meaning. In the story, Los Angeles becomes a gathering point. Birmingham becomes a pilgrimage. And the physical world starts to fill with evidence that grief needs somewhere to go. People don't just cry. They place something down. They leave a symbol as if that might stitch a hole in the air. The family, however, chooses privacy. No cameras, no press, no public spectacle. In a way, that decision becomes a final act of control in a life that often seemed out of control. Ozzy's public years were repeatedly shaped by narratives that weren't his: headlines, rumors, moral panics, ridicule, myth-making. A private funeral rejects all of that. It says, this ending belongs to us, not to the world. The story hints at the possibility of a larger memorial later. Something public, something that fits the scale of his impact, but it keeps the focus on immediate days, when the people closest to him are just trying to survive the quiet. And the quiet is brutal, because it arrives in layers. First, the quiet in the hospital room after the last words. Then the quiet at home when a familiar chair sits empty. Then the quiet in the morning when no one needs to measure medication or check vitals. Caregiving creates a relentless rhythm, and when that rhythm stops, grief often rushes in to fill the space that routine used to occupy. That is what makes the narrative's final pivot so effective. It reframes Ozzy's legacy not as sainthood, not as redemption, not as a clean moral arc, but as survival. The story says he didn't want to be remembered as a saint. He wanted to be remembered as someone who endured. And that idea lands because it matches what people watched for decades. A man who should have burned out young, who nearly destroyed himself, who fell and got back up in full view of the world again and again. Survival, in this context, is not a slogan. It's a stubborn, imperfect victory. It includes addiction, relapse, pain, consequences, apologies that came late, and love that had to work harder than it should have. It includes the humiliations of aging in public, the losses of physical independence, the struggle to keep creating when the body won't cooperate. Yet it also includes a rare courage of vulnerability, speaking openly about illness, letting the public see the frailty, not dressing it up as heroism, just letting it be true. And that is where the final words motif, whether perfectly accurate or not, becomes emotionally believable, because gratitude is often what remains when everything else has been stripped away. Not the cleverness, not the reputation, not the fights. Gratitude. Thank you. I loved it. I loved you. Those are the only sentences that still fit when time runs out. In the end, the story insists, the Prince of Darkness didn't leave as a spectacle. He left as a man in a room, surrounded by family, with nothing left to prove. The world grieved the icon, but the people closest to him grieved the human being, the one who asked for tea the right way, who watched old films for comfort, who held a hand instead of making a speech. And that may be the hardest truth of all. Legends don't disappear in a flash. They fade the way everyone fades, quietly, intimately, leaving behind an echo that lives in other people's lives long after the monitors go silent. In the days after the headlines cooled and the trending phrases slipped beneath the next cycle of noise, something more complicated began to happen. The world did what it always does when it loses a cultural giant. It built a monument out of memory. But monuments are for the living. Grief, for the people closest to Ozzy, was not a monument. It was an empty chair. It was a quiet in a hallway that used to hold the sound of a familiar voice. It was a strange, disorienting moment when you realize that the crisis you've been bracing for has arrived, and now there is nothing left to brace against. That is where Ozzy's story, at least as his narrative tells it, becomes less about death and more about what remains. Because what remains is never clean. It isn't a neat highlight reel. It's a tangle of contradictions, chaos and kindness, self-destruction and stubborn endurance, the myth and the man. The YouTube narration leans into one word, survival, as the key that unlocks his legacy. Not sainthood, not redemption, survival. And the more you sit with that, the more it fits. Ozzy was not an artist who simply had a career. He was an artist who repeatedly outlived a version of himself the world thought would end him. Addiction, accidents, public implosions, and all the slow-motion consequences of living too fast. There were years when survival felt like a technicality, something that happened by luck as much as by will. Yet he kept waking up. He kept returning. Sometimes battered, sometimes humbled, sometimes still reckless in spirit, even when his body refused to follow. That is why the narrative's tone shifts from sorrow into something quieter and more reflective. It suggests that in his final years, especially after publicly acknowledging Parkinson's, there was a visible change in the way he spoke. Less bravado, more honesty. Less performance, more recognition of what he had actually been granted. Time. Time that many assumed he would never have. Time long enough to become a grandfather who could hold a child's hand. Time long enough to see his own myth age into something almost tender. Time long enough to face the truth that the body always collects its debts. And then the story draws a line between public image and private reality. For decades, Ozzy's public persona had been framed as an emblem of excess, an icon of rebellion, scandal, and rock and roll survival by sheer audacity. But in the final stretch, the intimate details take over. The need for assistance, the meticulous routines, the careful management of pain, the gentle limits placed on visitors. The Prince of Darkness becomes a man learning how to accept help without humiliation. That's not a glamorous lesson. It's one most people learn in private, without cameras, without a lifetime of strangers projecting their fantasies onto you. The narrative suggests that what made his final words, or the idea of his final words, so powerful was that they sounded nothing like a legend trying to be legendary. They sounded like someone who had finally stopped bargaining with the world. Thank you. I love doing it. From the bottom of my heart. Whether or not those exact syllables were spoken exactly that way, the emotional truth behind them is believable. Gratitude is often what remains when performance ends. When you have nothing left to sell, nothing left to prove, the only honest currency is appreciation. And appreciation, in this story, isn't directed only at fans. It's directed inward, toward the people who held the structure of his life together when the structure was failing. Sharon, especially, becomes a quiet center of the aftermath. The narrative doesn't need to sensationalize her grief. It simply shows what it costs to be the strong one for too long. There's a particular kind of loneliness that follows a long caregiving journey. You spend years organizing chaos, appointments, medications, decisions, boundaries, until the role becomes your identity. Then the person you were caring for is gone, and the role evaporates overnight. What remains is love with nowhere to go. For Jack and Kelly, the grief is described as both personal and public. The world wants statements. The family wants silence. That tension is hard enough for ordinary people. For a family whose life has been televised, documented, debated, and mocked, it becomes almost unbearable. Every private feeling risks becoming a headline. Every pause risks becoming speculation. The narrative suggests they respond the only way they can, with simplicity, with short, direct messages, with restraint. Because sometimes the only protection left is to speak as little as possible. At the same time, the public mourning continues to take physical form. Fans gather at meaningful places, clubs, streets, hometown corners, leaving offerings as if grief requires a transaction. Flowers for a song, a candle for a memory, a letter for a voice that once made them feel less alone. This is not about celebrity worship, so much as communal processing. People use rituals to make the invisible feel real. They need a place to stand while they accept that something has ended. But the story's most important move is what it does after mourning. It repositions Ozzy's ending as a lesson about aging in rock and roll. The mythology of the genre often celebrates burning out young, dying dramatic, leaving a clean legend behind. Ozzy did the opposite. He aged. He declined in public. He showed the world what it looks like when a body fails slowly instead of collapsing at once. That visibility can be uncomfortable, but it also carries a rare dignity. It tells fans a truth. There is no shame in limitation. There is no dishonor in needing help. There is only the human reality of time doing what time does. And that may be the most lasting echo of all. Not the spectacle, not the scandal, not even the songs, though the songs will keep playing. The echo is the idea that survival itself can be a legacy, messy, imperfect, painfully earned. A man who never pretended to be clean or easy, who lived loud and complicated, who stayed long enough to say goodbye on his own terms. In the end, the story of Ozzy Osbourne does not close with a guitar scream. It closes with something far more unsettling: quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wrong at first, because for decades the world had trained itself to associate his name with noise, controversy, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. Yet this narrative insists that the final chapter was not written in spectacle, but in stillness. Stillness that came after a long life spent outrunning consequences, and after a final public bow that looked directly at truth. That quiet is not emptiness. It is presence. It is what remains when the performance ends, and there is no reason to pretend. In the hospital room, the story says, there were no theatrics, only family, machines that measured time without mercy, and a man who chose to leave behind gratitude rather than drama. Whether or not every word attributed to him can be verified, the emotional shape of the ending carries a recognizable truth. Most people, when they finally reach the edge, do not deliver speeches. They offer the simplest possible message to the people who mattered: love, thanks, peace. And that is why the last line, what he supposedly saved for the final moment, hurts so much in this kind of storytelling, because it is not clever. It is not edgy. It is not designed to preserve an image. It is designed to comfort the people who will have to live after him. In that sense, the Prince of Darkness becomes something unexpectedly tender at the finish, a man aware enough to think about what his absence will do to those he leaves behind. After the death, the world reacted the way it always does: fast, loud, and communal. Tributes, playlists, old clips, shock, nostalgia. But public grief has a short attention span. It moves on to the next headline. Private grief does not. Private grief stays in the house. It sits at the table. It wakes up in the middle of the night and reaches to the side of the bed that no longer moves. For Sharon, for Jack, for Kelly, the loss is not an event. It is a new geography. The home they build around caregiving, schedules, medications, routines, suddenly becomes a place with too much empty air. And yet the narrative suggests something else also begins in that emptiness: redefinition. With Ozzy gone, people are forced to decide what they actually believe his life meant. For years, the culture reduced him to symbols: the madman, the shock figure, the cautionary tale, the reality TV dad, the rock and roll caricature. But death strips caricatures down to their core. When the noise fades, you're left with questions that are harder to laugh off. What was he really beneath the myth? A monster? A clown? A genius? A survivor? A wounded man who made a career out of turning his damage into sound? This is where the story you shared pushes its most durable theme: endurance. It reframes his legacy as something more complicated than greatest hits. Ozzy's life becomes a case study in surviving the kind of excess that typically kills people long before old age. He lived long enough to face the slow humiliations of the body failing, long enough to show the world that aging is not romantic, and long enough to offer a final goodbye in the very city where it started. That matters. Not because it makes a neat moral lesson, but because it breaks the fantasy that rock legends only belong to the young and the reckless. Ozzy's ending forces a genre to confront something it usually avoids: the truth that survival does not always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like assistance. Sometimes it looks like tremors. Sometimes it looks like sitting in a chair and letting others perform while you watch, holding yourself together with sheer will and love. And maybe that is why fans cling so tightly to the idea of his final words. People want a key that unlocks the meaning of the whole story. They want one sentence that can organize grief. But perhaps the real final words were not spoken in a hospital at all. Perhaps they were spoken in the shape of his last public appearance, his willingness to be seen as he was, without pretending. That appearance was a message. I am not invincible. I never was. I'm still here. Thank you for walking with me. When you look at it that way, the legacy becomes less about controversy and more about connection. A global community of fans, scattered across decades and continents, found something in his voice that made them feel understood. Some found permission to be angry. Some found humor in the darkness. Some found a soundtrack for survival. And when he left, what remained was not only music, but the sense that a flawed person can still matter profoundly to other flawed people. So the story ends where it began, with a question. Not was he good, or was he terrible, but something much harder to answer cleanly.